Argument number 5, editorial fatigue. This argument has been growing in popularity in recent years, particularly as older arguments have become less tenable. I suggest that this is probably the best argument for Markan priority. As a quick recap from the second segment in this series on what editorial fatigue is, this is when author 2 is copying from author 1 and makes some changes. Perhaps they think they can tell the story a little bit better, a little more clearly, but sometimes they fail to sustain the changes throughout and fall back on using the original author's language, thus tipping us off as to who their source was. One of the most popular examples of editorial fatigue in the Gospels is in Matthew's account of the execution of John the Baptist by Herod Antipas. Mark consistently refers to Antipas as a king. Although Antipas may have styled himself as such, he was actually lower on the totem pole. Antipas's title was Tetrarch. When Matthew tells the story, he starts by correctly referring to Herod as a tetrarch, but later on refers to Herod Antipas as a king. On Markan priority, this is explicable by saying that Matthew was copying from Mark. The first time he saw Mark say king, he said, oh no, he wasn't a king, he was a tetrarch, and he corrected it. But he forgot to make the change later. Another case of editorial fatigue is when author 1 introduces some context at the beginning of the story and then refers to it later. Author 2, in copying from author 1, does not introduce the context earlier, but still refers to it later, having apparently forgotten that they didn't tell that part of the story in their own account. A prominent example of this in the Gospels is in the pericope, or story, of Jesus' mother and brethren. Here Mark explicitly tells us that they're in a house. Matthew mentions crowds, but not the house. Later, both Mark and Matthew tell us that his mother and brethren are outside, and the reader of Matthew is left to wonder, outside of what? Matthew didn't tell us that they were in a house, Mark did. I submit that these arguments are much more evidence-based than those we've considered previously, but using editorial fatigue to argue for Markan priority suffers from 3 substantial shortfalls. Shortfall number 1. This argument, too, is reversible. We can find evidence going the other way, where it looks like Mark is copying from Matthew. James Deerdorf has written on this, and I'll cite a few of his examples. How much bread did the disciples bring? Compare Mark 8 with Matthew 16. What is the reward being referred to? Compare Mark 9 with Matthew 10. Where did Bartimaeus go after being healed? Compare Mark 10 with Matthew 20. And what did the Romans do with Jesus' clothes? Compare Mark 15 to Matthew 27. In each case, there is context provided by Matthew that is either different or excluded in Mark, but both Matthew and Mark later refer to the Matthean context, suggesting that it is Mark who is editorially fatigued in copying from Matthew. Given evidence pointing in multiple directions, editorial fatigue is unclear as an indicator of source. Now, perhaps Mark and Matthew got together in some as-yet unknown synoptic conspiracy and deliberately mixed up the evidence for the sole purpose of confusing scholars today. Or maybe we have to allow that different authors thought about different details at different times in recounting a story. Shortfall number 2. What if Mark is providing context to clarify an unclear story in Matthew? Mark is the master storyteller. It is notable that proponents of Markan priority frequently point to the clarity of Matthew and say clearly Matthew wrote second because he's expanding upon and embellishing Mark's writings. So we're told that when Mark has greater clarity, clearly Mark wrote first. And when Mark has lesser clarity, clearly Mark wrote first. I'm not sure this argument is so clear after all. This logical inconsistency betrays a presupposition of Markan priority into which the evidence is then forced to fit. Shortfall number 3. This argument isn't the only way to explain the data. In segment 6 in this series, we'll look at another hypothesis that can also explain this evidence of editorial fatigue, but without the shortcomings we've cited here. In summary then, editorial fatigue can be used to suggest that Matthew or Mark wrote first, but does not make an incontrovertible case for either. Editorial fatigue is probably the strongest argument for Markan priority, but it remains inconclusive.